So in a nutshell, these are the key messages of the lecture. Like all industries, telecoms is governed by policy and regulation, which set the parameters for, among other things, how industry players can enter the market, how they operate, or whether they would thrive or not, and which standards they can adopt. The Philippines uses analog era policy and regulation that may hamper innovation and prevent the adoption of new technologies and standards like Open RAN. Policy reforms that can support Open RAN include removal of the congressional franchise for putting up a network, something that is very unique to the Philippines. Also removing the franchise for spectrum use, as well as getting a permit for demonstrating wireless technology, which still needs an endorsement from a telco with a franchise. Regional licensing of spectrum can also be useful, and perhaps a special financing mechanism to support the deployment of Open RAN in unserved and underserved areas. But in the end, we have to remember that it's market adoption that will best determine the fate of a tech standard. Okay, so let's start by talking about the concept of public policy. So this is just a crash course on policy. Policy is a purposive course of action followed by an actor or set of actors in dealing with the problem. So when you talk of policy, any group can have a policy, like companies or a small group, homeowners associations have policies. But what makes public policy different is that it's a decision made by the government that applies to a particular area of activity. So bear in mind that the word public here means the state, and the state represented by the government. Anything that the government consciously chooses to do, or even those that they choose not to do, is actually considered public policy. Most of the time, public policy attempts to get people like you and I, or enable us to do things that we would otherwise not have done. Regulation is a particular type of public policy that seeks to control or direct behavior, again, getting us to do something we would otherwise not have done, impose controls and restrictions on specific activities. Hence the word regulation that comes from the word regulate. In policy and regulation, the government is the primary actor. It has the unique ability to make the authoritative decision, operative word authoritative, on behalf of the citizens. So as a side note, we have to remember that policy directly affects our lives. So please don't vote for policymakers whose decisions don't represent your values or your interests. So whenever we vote, we have to make that connection. Ano bang nangyayari sa paligid ko tsaka sa buhay ko? And what's the connection with policymakers? Apart from government, non-government actors may also influence government decisions. Usually, when making policy or regulation, non-government actors such as business, civil society, social groups can provide inputs via public hearings or stakeholder consultations, or also through informal means. So if public policy is the what, policy making is the why and how. So it is it is inherently political actually, because policy making involves people with conflicting interests, values, and desires. It is essentially a problem-solving process, and it involves several steps. So for example, actually the one that you see on the screen is just a very basic and simplified policy cycle. So agenda setting, for example, the policymakers list a set of legitimate problems that merit attention. Hindi naman lahat dapat ng problem gawin natin ilagay sa agenda, di ba? Sa dami ng problema ng mundo or ng Pilipinas, policymakers need to focus on the most legitimate problems. In policy formulation, that's where policy is drafted. It's designed to remedy a particular problem, whether real or potential. So kahit imagine problem pa lang, policy usually would like to look at potential problems that may arise. Decision making is the actual choosing among the various alternatives of the policy that is likely to address a particular problem. So this is actually the most political stage, because this is where the haggling, the negotiation, and the compromises take place. After you choose a policy, there's policy implementation. Well, that's when the programs or policies are being carried out. So here at this stage, it's very important to see who implements the policy and what are the factors that that affect the implementation of the policy. And finally, evaluation. And I think as a policy researcher, evaluation is where the Philippines is very weak at. This is where we find out the results of policy implementation and whether a policy is actually accomplishing its expected goals. So after this, the government can decide whether a policy will be kept, will be changed, or terminated. Okay. So when you go to school or when you study public policy, the textbooks will tell you that the policy cycle looks something like this, just like what I mentioned earlier. But what is policy making really like? Basically, various stakeholders are competing to get in, to influence the process, policymakers, and each other. Policymaking is a balancing act, and the result is often a compromise or of various positions and interests. So what you're seeing here is something that actually happens in real life. Um, I am an ICT policy researcher, but I'm also a practicing policy analyst. So whenever I engage with policymakers, whether in Congress or in the executive branch, this is really what it actually looks like on the ground. But the important thing here to remember is that as part of civil society or as part of the private sector, we have the right and the power to influence policy.